I never expected that leaving 2 minutes early could destroy a career. The executives who publicly branded me a time thief carelessly left my name on federal records worth tens of millions of dollars. They thought they were teaching me a harsh lesson in discipline. They failed to realize that what truly kills an empire is never a loud scream. It is a forged signature, a mismatched timestamp, and a woman who did her job flawlessly. My name is Brinley Diaz. I am 34 years old. Until a freezing Thursday evening in late November, I was the Senior Labor and Vendor Compliance Analyst at CrownSpire Mobility Group. CrownSpire is a massive private contracting firm currently swimming in cash, feeding relentlessly off federal public infrastructure grants across the state of Ohio. We build highways, we expand transit systems, and we manage sprawling public works, or rather, the laborers do the building. The executives in our Columbus headquarters just count the grant money. My job was to make sure they counted it legally and kept the federal auditors away from our doors. For 8 long years, I was the absolute model of corporate invisibility and ironclad reliability. I was the person they called when the numbers did not add up. I was the one who quietly fixed the catastrophic regulatory blind spots created by executives whose annual bonuses eclipsed my entire decade of earnings. I had 0 instances of tardiness. I engaged in 0 office drama. I missed 0 deadlines. I was not a shining star looking for a ruthless promotion to the executive floor. I was the load-bearing pillar in a basement no one ever wanted to inspect. I found quiet pride in my competence. I believed, foolishly, that executing my job flawlessly offered a permanent shield against the erratic cruelty of corporate America. That illusion began to fracture the moment the company brought in a new head of human resources. Her name was Talia Voss. Talia was a woman possessed by a terrifying, almost clinical obsession with what she branded a culture of absolute accountability. In practice, this meant she weaponized the employee handbook to feed her own ego. She did not care about productivity, efficiency, or employee morale. She cared entirely about dominance. Talia loved to transform minor, insignificant rules into sweeping, theatrical displays of her own power. She would pace the aisles of our open-plan office in her designer heels, searching for violations like a hawk hunting prey. A coffee mug left on a desk overnight, a security badge attached to the wrong side of a jacket, a lunch break that stretched exactly 1 minute past the allotted hour. All of these were treated as mortal sins against the CrownSpire family. The atmosphere in the office rapidly shifted from mildly stressful to genuinely toxic. People stopped talking in the break rooms. The low hum of casual conversation was replaced by the frantic, paranoid clacking of keyboards. Everyone was terrified of catching Talia's eye and becoming her next project. Then came the day that severed my ties to that world forever. It was a Thursday, a perfectly normal, unremarkable Thursday. The compliance server had been down for scheduled maintenance most of the afternoon, meaning my team had spent hours meticulously organizing physical vendor files while we waited for network access to be restored. Around 4 in the afternoon, my direct manager, Nolan Price, stood up from his cubicle. Nolan was a fundamentally weak man, the kind of middle manager who survived purely by agreeing with whoever happened to be shouting the loudest at any given moment. He clapped his hands together to get our attention. "Listen up, everyone," Nolan said, forcing a cheerful tone that did not quite reach his eyes. "It just sent word that the system maintenance is completely wrapped up early. Also, executive leadership is hosting a massive VIP client event in the main lobby starting at 5 in the evening. Security is going to start blocking off the employee parking lot exits soon to make room for the catering trucks and the black cars. If you are at a stopping point, you can head out a few minutes early to beat the bottleneck and clear the way. Have a good evening." It was a direct directive from my supervisor. A logical, practical suggestion to avoid a logistical nightmare in the parking garage. I spent the next 45 minutes finishing a review of a subcontractor's labor ledger, ensuring every single line item was perfectly aligned for the upcoming audit cycle. I logged off, packed my laptop into my satchel, put on my heavy winter coat, and walked toward the main exit. I reached the security turnstiles. I pulled my lanyard from my pocket and swiped my plastic badge against the scanner. A green light flashed, granting me exit. The large digital clock mounted above the security desk displayed the time in bright red numerals. It was exactly 4:58 in the afternoon. I was leaving exactly 2 minutes before the official end of the workday. I walked out into the cold Ohio wind, got into my car, and drove home, entirely convinced that this was just a microscopic, insignificant detail, just like the dozens of other times Nolan had let the team leave early to avoid traffic jams. I was profoundly wrong. At 7 in the evening, I was sitting in my small, dimly lit apartment, eating a bowl of reheated pasta, when my phone vibrated violently against the wood of my dining table. It was a push notification from my secure work email application. I usually ignored work communications after hours, a boundary I had fought hard to establish, but the subject line displayed on my lock screen seized my attention immediately. It was flagged with high importance, marked with a bright red exclamation point. The subject line read, "Policy Enforcement Notice." I unlocked my phone and opened the email. The air in my apartment seemed to freeze. My stomach plummeted, a heavy, sickening drop that left me breathless. Staring back at me from the glowing screen was my own face. It was my official corporate badge photo, blown up to an absurd size and centered directly at the top of the message. Below my face, bold red text announced my professional execution to the entire company. The email stated that Brinley Diaz, Senior Labor and Vendor Compliance Analyst, had been terminated, effective immediately. The stated cause was gross misconduct and time theft. The email detailed, with terrifying bureaucratic precision, that I had intentionally abandoned my post before the designated end of operational hours, deliberately stealing company time and violating the core integrity policies of Crownspire Mobility Group. 2 minutes. They had fired me for leaving 2 minutes early, acting on the explicit permission of my own manager, but the sheer absurdity of the accusation was not the worst part. The true horror revealed itself when my eyes drifted upward to examine the recipient list. This email was not just sent to the internal all-staff distribution list. It had not been contained within the walls of our Columbus headquarters. By some catastrophic failure of judgment, or perhaps by intentional, malicious design, the sender had included a massive external mailing list. My hands began to shake as I read the names and domains in the copy line. The email had gone out to our local project partners. It had gone out to the executives of our subcontracting firms. And most devastatingly, it had been delivered directly to the inbox of a senior member of the State Grant Oversight Board. The very people I corresponded with every single day, the people I audited, the people who relied on my meticulous attention to detail to keep their projects legally compliant and federally funded, were currently reading a public declaration that I was a thief. My professional reputation, built carefully over 8 years of flawless work, was being publicly slaughtered in real time. I sat alone in the heavy silence of my kitchen. The food on my plate grew cold. The glow of the phone screen cast long, pale shadows across the walls. I did not cry. There were no tears, no hysterical sobs, no frantic urges to call Nolan and beg for my job back. I did not draft a desperate, angry reply to the company detailing the severe injustice of the situation. Instead, a terrifying, absolute clarity washed over my mind. A cold, hard rationality replaced the initial shock of the betrayal. I realized exactly what was happening. This was not an automated error generated by a faulty time clock. This was not a standard HR procedure gone slightly awry. You do not accidentally draft a customized termination notice, attach a giant photo of the employee, brand them a corporate thief over 120 seconds, and distribute it to government oversight officials. You do that when you want to make a spectacular, unforgettable point. They did not intend to fire me quietly in the dignity of a sterile conference room. They had deliberately chosen to execute me in the public square. They intended to use me as a living, breathing warning sign. I was the perfect target. I was a senior employee, which made my downfall impactful. But I was not an executive, which meant I had no political armor to protect me from the blast. They thought destroying me would terrify the rest of the workforce into absolute, unquestioning submission under Talia's new regime. They thought I would slink away in shame. They thought I would be too humiliated to fight back, too broken by the public degradation to do anything but hide and update my resume in the dark. They thought they were teaching me a harsh lesson about corporate discipline. They had no idea what they had just done. I walked into the glass-walled conference room at exactly 9 in the morning on Friday. The building security guard had escorted me up the freight elevator like a criminal being transferred to a maximum security ward. Talia Voss sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table. Her posture was perfectly rigid, her hands folded neatly over a pristine manila folder. There was no awkwardness in her demeanor. There was no trace of human hesitation or professional regret. I sat across from her, keeping my face entirely blank. The company-wide notification was a necessary step, Talia said. Her voice was as sterile and cold as the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above us. Crownspire Mobility Group is transitioning to a new transparency model. We cannot demand absolute accountability from the ground floor if we hide the infractions of our senior analysts. You understand that this is about establishing a standard. Your departure serves the greater good of the corporate culture. I did not nod. I did not offer her the satisfaction of an argument. I just watched her. She slid a thick severance agreement across the long table, outlining the immediate termination of my health benefits and the complete locking of my corporate assets. She detailed how my payroll account was frozen. My physical building badge was deactivated. My internal email routing was permanently severed. She recited the checklist with the practiced, upbeat rhythm of a salesperson closing a routine deal. Human Resources had prepared this exact script well in advance, but as I listened to her itemize the digital doors they had slammed shut, my mind snagged on a glaring, catastrophic omission. I was a person who spent every day of her life looking for missing pieces of data. I noticed the void instantly. She never mentioned the external federal compliance portal. I left the building carrying a small, pathetic cardboard box containing my favorite coffee mug and a few framed photographs. The drive back to my apartment was totally silent. The heater in my car was broken, but I barely felt the bitter winter chill seeping through the windows. My brain was running a frantic, hyper-focused diagnostic check on every single document I had touched during my last 48 hours at the desk. Then, the memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Right before the system maintenance window opened on Thursday morning, I had been drafting a highly sensitive compliance memo. It was an unfinished document flagging severe mathematical discrepancies in a Tier 2 subcontractor file and a series of concrete site payrolls. More importantly, I remembered the upcoming federal draw schedule. I walked into my small apartment, dropped the cardboard box onto the living room floor, and immediately opened my personal laptop. Over my 8 years in the industry, I had developed a strict, unwavering habit of keeping legally permissible, redundant backups of my own compliance logs. It was a necessary survival mechanism in a company that frequently tried to rewrite history to suit its quarterly profit margins. I accessed my heavily encrypted personal drive. The bright screen illuminated the dim room, casting a sharp glow across my face. I meticulously opened the raw access logs, the saved email threads requesting urgent ledger corrections from project managers, the digital signature warning flags, and the master labor cost reconciliations. I routed my connection through the external vendor gateway. This was a completely separate backdoor access point designed specifically for off-site federal auditors, allowing me to check the current status of the project portal without using the internal company network. My breath caught in my throat. There it was on the screen. My credential profile was still completely active on the external federal compliance gateway. Talia had brutally severed my internal access, but she lacked the administrative clearance, or perhaps just the basic technical competence, to revoke my federal certifier status on the government domain. The reality was even worse than I anticipated. I navigated to the pending submission queue for the massive federal grant drawdown scheduled for the upcoming Monday morning. My name was still hard-coded into the final authorized certifier field. The executive team was preparing to request tens of millions of dollars in taxpayer funds, and they were planning to use my digital identity to swear, under penalty of perjury, that those funds were perfectly compliant with federal law. I closed the laptop screen until it was just a thin sliver of light. I sat in the quiet isolation of my kitchen for a very long time. The most logical professional action would be to immediately call the corporate legal department. I should have sent a certified email to the general counsel, loudly warning them of the massive legal exposure they were creating. I should have screamed that they were setting themselves up for a catastrophic compliance failure. I did not type a single warning. I did not make a single phone call. My silence was an expensive one, but I was willing to pay the price. I did not withhold the information out of some chaotic, immediate thirst for petty revenge. I stayed silent because a cold, absolute clarity had taken over my mind. The people who had gleefully and publicly humiliated me, who had smeared my name across the entire industry just to strike fear into their subordinates, did not care about the truth. They did not care about regulatory compliance. They only cared about absolute power and uninterrupted cash flow. If I warned them, they would simply fix the error, replace my name with another analyst, and continue their careless reign, leaving me permanently destroyed in their wake. I decided to let them drive blindly into the abyss. A sudden chill ran down my spine, born from the realization of a specific, mechanical trap that was already set and waiting for them to step on the trigger. Exactly 2 weeks prior to my termination, I had been auditing a separate infrastructure package. I had noticed an alarming, aggressive pattern in the server logs. Someone from the executive suite had been repeatedly attempting to force a massive file submission through the portal before my final labor reconciliation was complete. It was a blatant, dangerous attempt to bypass the mandatory audit phase in order to secure a faster payout from the state. I never caught the exact person doing it, but I took immediate, silent action to protect my own legal liability. I went deep into the administrative system settings and activated the dual authentication integrity lock. It was an obscure, rarely used federal security protocol designed for high-risk contracts. I linked the lock directly to my specific employee identification hash. The mechanism was incredibly simple but brutally unforgiving. If the integrity lock was active, any final submission required my active, verified credential. However, if a submission was pushed through using my name, while my internal corporate status was simultaneously flagged as inactive or terminated on the company main server, the system would not simply block the request and ask for a retry. It would immediately interpret the action as a hostile forgery attempt on a federal financial document. The protocol would automatically generate an indelible, unalterable digital footprint. It would silently timestamp the fraudulent entry. It would lock the submitted documents into a read-only evidentiary vault. And most importantly, it would trigger an immediate, automated alert directly to the oversight database in Washington. Talia Voss had just fired me. By officially removing me from the payroll, she had updated my internal corporate status to terminated, but my name was still sitting on the Monday morning federal draw. They had proudly locked the doors to the physical building, but they had unknowingly left my ghost inside the machine. If any executive at Crownspire Mobility Group dared to press the submit button on Monday morning, believing they could casually use the name of the woman they just threw away like garbage, they would not just be making a sloppy bureaucratic error. They would be actively committing federal wire fraud. I leaned back in my wooden chair. The digital clock on my oven glowed bright green in the dark apartment. The weekend had just begun. The trap was armed and loaded. All I had to do was sit in the silence and wait for them to pull the lever themselves. Monday arrived with a heavy, overcast sky pressing down on the city. I sat at my kitchen counter at 6:30 in the morning, holding a ceramic mug of black coffee. The apartment was completely silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of my refrigerator. I opened my personal laptop, the screen illuminating my face in the dim light, and initiated the secure handshake protocol with the external federal repository. A part of my brain, the part still conditioned by years of corporate obedience, expected a gray wall of text declaring my access permanently denied. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, waiting for the system to recognize my termination and sever the connection. Instead, the administrative dashboard loaded instantly. The intricate architecture of the federal database spread out before me. My privileges were still completely intact. I navigated straight to the Active Submissions tab. The interface of the oversight portal was usually a calm, sterile spectrum of muted blues and greens, designed to induce a sense of bureaucratic order. Today, the screen was bleeding neon red. A massive compliance packet had been shoved through the gateway. I checked the digital timestamp embedded in the corner of the file. It was processed on Friday night at 11:45. That was roughly 30 hours after my face had been plastered across the internet by human resources as a terminated time thief. I clicked on the master file to expand the view. I scrolled past the summary pages, down to the final certification block. This specific block was the digital equivalent of swearing a binding oath on a Bible in a federal courtroom. There, sitting perfectly centered in the authorized signature field, was my full legal name. However, the federal machine was not easily fooled by a simple copy and paste job. Beneath my forged signature, two glaring red banners pulsed with mechanical fury across the screen. The first system warning read, "Inactive employee credential." The moment Talia Voss had officially scrubbed me from the payroll system on Friday evening, the federal portal had performed its routine midnight synchronization with the corporate directory. The machine knew I was dead to the company. The second system warning was the fatal one. It read, "Signature hash mismatch." This was the quiet, invisible trap I had set weeks ago finally snapping its iron jaws shut. Because I had engaged the dual authentication integrity lock, the portal required a secondary verification ping from my specific physical workstation IP address to validate the signature. Whoever had pushed this file through had done it from a different terminal, likely an executive suite computer hidden behind a mahogany door. The mismatch meant the system instantly and irrevocably classified the submission as a hostile forgery. I dug deeper into the encrypted payload to see exactly what they had tried to smuggle through under my name. My blood turned to ice as I reviewed the attached appendix. The executives had not just forged my name on a routine monthly invoice or a basic material expense report. They had attached the certified payroll compliance ledgers and the disadvantaged business enterprise vendor participation report. I stared at the screen, my coffee completely forgotten. These were not administrative suggestions or internal corporate guidelines. These were the two most sensitive, heavily audited, legally binding documents in the entire federal contracting universe. The certified payroll proved that every single laborer on the site was being paid the mandatory federal prevailing wage. The vendor participation report proved that CrownSpire was fulfilling its strict legal obligation to allocate a specific percentage of its budget to minority and women-owned businesses. If a company failed to meet those standards, they lost their grant funding. If a company faked the documents to pretend they met those standards, it was no longer a corporate misdemeanor. It was a straight, undeniable line to a federal grand jury. By stamping my name on these specific files while I was legally terminated, someone at the top of the food chain had attempted to make me the unwitting fall guy for a massive, multi-million-dollar cover-up. But the cold, unfeeling logic of the machine had outsmarted their arrogance. Because the integrity lock had been tripped by the mismatched signature hash and the dead credential, the federal portal did not simply reject the file back to the sender with a polite request to try again. It automatically executed a severe quarantine protocol. The system instantly locked the entire submission, along with all its metadata, into an unalterable, read-only evidentiary vault. Nobody at CrownSpire could delete it. Nobody could unsend it. The digital concrete had dried. More importantly, the system generated an immediate, high-priority distress signal. I checked the server routing log. The automated alert had already bypassed the local state authorities. It had been fired directly into the inbox of the Office of Transit Grant Oversight in Washington. That specific agency was not a friendly advisory board. They were a hard-nosed federal audit unit that specialized in infrastructure fraud. They did not send polite letters asking for clarification. They sent investigators with subpoenas and the authority to tear the place apart. I sat back in my chair. I did not need to hire an employment lawyer. I did not need to call a whistleblower hotline and wait months for an investigation to begin. I did not even need to type a single angry email defending my honor. CrownSpire Mobility Group had just kicked down the door of the federal government and loudly announced their own crimes. As I sat there absorbing the sheer magnitude of their mistake, a new notification pinged in the upper right corner of my screen. When I originally set up my remote compliance access years earlier, I had created a simple forwarding rule. It was a simple script that forwarded blindly copied calendar invites from the compliance team inbox to my secure external viewer, just in case a deadline was altered while I was out in the field doing site inspections. The IT department had remembered to shut off my main company email account, but they had completely forgotten to disable that hidden calendar feed. I opened the intercepted message. It was an urgent, mandatory meeting invitation dispatched at exactly 7:30 in the morning. The sender was Grant Mercer, the Chief Operating Officer of CrownSpire. The recipient list was a breathtaking collection of corporate panic. He had summoned Talia Voss from Human Resources, the entire executive legal team, and the head of the contracts division. The subject line was written entirely in capital letters, abandoning all pretense of corporate composure. It read, "Urgent discussion regarding submission anomaly and portal lockdown." The body of the email was brief and frantic. It demanded everyone assemble in the main executive boardroom on the top floor immediately. It stated that the federal gateway was completely unresponsive, rejecting all login attempts from the executive suite, and was displaying critical error codes that the internal IT department could not decipher or override. I smiled. It was a thin, cold smile in the quiet of my apartment. Grant Mercer and Talia Voss were currently standing in an expensive room, staring at a locked screen, realizing that their invisible system architecture was completely out of their control. The humiliating email they had blasted out on Friday evening, labeling me a time thief over a pitiful 2-minute discrepancy, was nothing but a tiny, insignificant spark. They thought they had burned me to the ground to establish their authority. They had no idea they had just dropped a lit match into a powder keg of federal fraud exposure, and the heavy steel doors to the room were already locked from the outside. The clock was officially ticking, and the machinery of the investigation was already moving toward them. My personal cell phone vibrated against the kitchen counter, shattering the tense silence of the morning. The caller ID displayed a name I never expected to see again. It was Nolan Price, my former direct manager. He was not calling. He had sent a long, rambling text message. I opened it. The tone was sickeningly sweet, dripping with a manufactured sympathy that made my stomach turn. "Hey Brinley," the message read, "I am so incredibly sorry about how things went down on Friday. I really think Human Resources went way too far and completely overstepped their bounds. Listen, things are a little crazy around here this morning with the portal. Is there any way you could just send a quick email to the External Oversight Board? Just tell them your login was glitching and the whole badge thing was a system syncing error. I can definitely put in a good word with Grant to get your severance increased if you help us smooth this over. Hope you are holding up okay." I stared at the glowing screen. Nolan was a coward, but he was not an initiator. He would never reach out to a terminated employee unless someone significantly higher up the food chain had ordered him to do it. The executive team was realizing that locking me out of the building did not lock me out of the narrative. They needed me to voluntarily discredit myself to the federal auditors, to explain away the massive red flags currently flying over their Monday morning submission. I did not reply. I did not even type a single letter. I simply locked my phone and set it face down on the counter. Instead, I turned my attention back to my encrypted archive of compliance logs. Nolan's desperate message was the final piece of a puzzle I had been staring at for weeks. If this was truly just about an overzealous human resources director trying to enforce a rigid attendance policy, they would not be begging me to cover for them. There was a much darker, much more expensive reason they needed me completely removed from the building before the new quarterly drawdown was finalized. I opened my archived email chains from the week prior to my termination. I filtered the search by unresolved vendor inquiries. Immediately, a specific name populated the screen, attached to 3 separate, highly flagged emails I had sent directly to the executive suite. Pine Trace Community Partners. According to the glossy, heavily manicured corporate brochures Grant Mercer loved to distribute to the state board, Pine Trace was our premier local outreach partner. They were officially classified as a disadvantaged business enterprise. Their stated role was to embed themselves in the local community, host job fairs, and recruit minority laborers for our massive public transit projects. For this noble service, Crown Spire Mobility Group had paid them hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last 3 quarters alone. There was only one glaring problem. As the senior compliance analyst, I had to verify their actual output, and the Pine Trace operational file was a complete, echoing void. I pulled up the digital folders I had saved. There were absolutely no field reports. There were no sign-in sheets from local community centers. There were no photographs of job fairs. There were no lists of recruited laborers integrated into our payroll system. The only documents inside the Pine Trace folder were perfectly formatted, massive monthly invoices, always approved directly by Grant Mercer, and always paid out within 48 hours. But the absence of work was not the detail that had sealed my fate. The fatal detail was something I had uncovered purely by accident during a routine tax form audit exactly 4 days before I was fired. I opened the saved W-9 tax form for Pine Trace. I highlighted the registered business address. It was not a community center in the inner city. It was a commercial suite located in a highly affluent, manicured suburban strip mall. Out of mild curiosity, I had run that specific address through the state commercial real estate registry. The suite was not leased to a community outreach program. It was leased to a boutique suburban insurance agency. The sole proprietor of that insurance agency was a man named Richard Vance. Richard Vance was Grant Mercer's brother-in-law. I sat back, the chilling reality washing over me. I had attached a bright red digital sticky note to the Pine Trace file, officially flagging it for potential pass-through fraud. In the federal contracting world, pass-through fraud is a highly lucrative, highly illegal scheme. A prime contractor claims a minority-owned vendor is performing crucial work to meet the strict percentage quotas required by the government grant, but in reality, the prime contractor does the work themselves, or does no work at all, and simply funnels the taxpayer money through the shell company to skim the profits. I was refusing to sign the final quarterly certification until the Pine Trace invoices were fully substantiated with hard evidence. I was standing directly in the way of a massive systematic embezzlement pipeline. They did not choose me as a sacrificial lamb because I left my desk 120 seconds early. They chose me because I was asking questions they could not legally answer. Talia Voss and her brutal new corporate discipline policies were just a convenient smokescreen. They needed a fast, public, and unquestionable reason to execute me so they could shove another, more compliant analyst into my chair to blindly sign the federal draw before the Monday deadline. While I was sitting in my kitchen assembling the pieces of their grand scheme, the atmosphere inside the Crown Spire headquarters was descending into absolute paranoid chaos. I would later learn exactly how far Talia Voss was willing to go to protect the illusion she had created, courtesy of a terrified source still trapped inside the building. Down on the 3rd floor, in the sterile Human Resources Department, Talia was actively trying to rewrite the past. The moment Grant Mercer realized the federal portal was rejecting my forged signature and screaming for an audit, Talia knew her official justification for my firing had to be completely watertight. She marched over to the desk of Sadie Cole. Sadie was 22 years old, a quiet, anxious university student completing her final semester internship with Crown Spire. She was entirely dependent on Talia for her graduation credit. Talia leaned over Sadie's cubicle wall, her voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. She ordered Sadie to immediately log into the back end of the corporate intranet and the internal employee communication channels. Talia demanded that Sadie completely scrub and permanently delete all historical messages, policy FAQ pages, and archived memos that stated a 5-minute grace period for early departure was permitted as long as the employee had explicit direct approval from their supervisor. "We are enforcing a strict zero-tolerance policy moving forward," Talia told the young intern. "Those old guidelines are confusing and obsolete. Erase them all. Make sure there is no trace left on the servers by 10 o'clock. Sadie Cole looked up at the towering human resources director. She was terrified. She knew exactly why Talia was ordering the digital purge. Everyone in the building had seen the email destroying my career over 2 minutes. Sadie knew she was being asked to destroy the very evidence that proved my firing was completely baseless under the existing company rules. Sadie swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly on her keyboard. "Yes, Miss Voss," she said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. "I will take care of it immediately." Talia nodded sharply and walked away, her heels clicking authoritatively against the tile floor. Completely confident that the frightened intern would blindly follow orders to save her own skin. But Talia severely underestimated the quiet observation skills of the lowest person on the corporate ladder. Sadie did not immediately hit the delete button. She opened the administrative portal and accessed the master policy documents and the specific chat logs where Nolan had approved my team to leave early. Before she executed Talia's order, Sadie opened a hidden desktop application. With meticulous, frantic precision, she took high-resolution screenshots of every single page. She captured the original policy language. She captured the timestamps showing the rules had been in place for years. She captured the exact message from Nolan giving us permission to leave early on Thursday afternoon. She bundled the dozens of images into a single, encrypted file and silently uploaded it to a private, external cloud drive that CrownSpire IT had zero access to. Only after the upload was completely verified and secure did Sadie Cole begin to press the delete key, wiping the company servers clean just as she was instructed. Talia thought she was erasing the trail of her own corruption. She did not realize she had just handed a key piece of evidence to a witness smart enough to preserve the entire trail. The executives thought they only had to worry about the federal machine I had left behind. They had no idea their own building was beginning to fracture from the inside out. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sipping my second cup of tea, completely physically removed from the polished glass and steel of the Columbus headquarters. But the precise details of that Tuesday morning would soon become corporate legend, recounted to me verbatim by the terrified people trapped inside the blast radius. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, 2 federal investigators from the Office of Transit Grant Oversight walked through the grand revolving doors of CrownSpire Mobility Group. They did not call ahead. They did not schedule an introductory meeting. They did not wait for the nervous receptionist to offer them complimentary sparkling water or artisanal coffee. They simply approached the grand marble desk, presented their heavy brass badges, and instructed the head of building security to escort them directly to the executive suite on the top floor. Grant Mercer and Talia Voss were already waiting in the main boardroom. They had spent all of Monday afternoon frantically rehearsing a carefully sanitized narrative. The executive team firmly believed the sudden federal visit was merely a routine inquiry regarding the locked portal and the rejected digital signature. They were completely prepared to play the roles of cooperative, transparent corporate leaders who had simply suffered a minor technical glitch during an unfortunate employee transition. Grant was wearing his custom-tailored navy suit, projecting an aura of calm, measured authority. Talia sat beside him, her posture flawless, a sleek leather binder resting on the polished mahogany table in front of her. They expected a quick, polite conversation. They expected to charm the government bureaucrats and send them on their way before lunch. They were completely unprepared for Maren Holt. Maren Holt was the lead investigator for the Regional Oversight Division. She did not wear a designer suit. She wore a practical, unbranded gray blazer over a crisp white blouse. She did not carry an expensive leather briefcase. She carried a heavy utilitarian canvas tote bag that looked like it had seen the inside of 100 different courtrooms. She walked into the expansive boardroom, declined Grant Mercer's outstretched hand with a brief, professional nod, and sat down at the opposite end of the long table. Her partner, a silent man holding a thick legal pad, sat next to her. Grant offered a practiced, reassuring smile. "Agent Holt, we appreciate you coming down so quickly," he began, his voice dropping into a smooth, commanding baritone. "We understand the external gateway triggered an automated alert yesterday morning regarding a credential discrepancy. We have our top information technology specialists pulling the server logs right now to explain the synchronization error. It was simply a matter of a terminated profile lingering in the federal cache." Maren Holt did not smile back. She did not open her notebook. She simply looked directly at the chief operating officer, with eyes as cold and flat as slate. "Mr. Mercer," Holt said, her voice cutting through the heavy corporate air like a surgical scalpel. "I am not here to discuss a server synchronization error. I am here to discuss your certified labor ledgers and your priority vendor allocations. I require the immediate, unredacted physical production of all site payroll certifications and all disadvantaged business enterprise participation reports spanning the last 3 consecutive fiscal quarters." The practiced smile vanished from Grant Mercer's face instantly. The air in the boardroom suddenly felt incredibly thin. He shifted in his expensive leather chair, the leather squeaking loudly in the quiet room. This was a catastrophic deviation from their script. The portal lock on Monday morning had been triggered by a single specific draw request. Grant had fully expected to contain the damage to that one isolated file. But Maren Holt was not asking about a single weekend glitch. She was casually ripping open a 9-month window into the darkest, most highly manipulated corners of their entire operational budget. She was walking straight toward the massive, systemic fraud I had been quietly documenting for weeks. Grant cleared his throat, desperately trying to regain his footing. "Agent Holt, that is an incredibly broad request. Those files encompass hundreds of thousands of individual labor hours and dozens of community partnerships. Gathering that volume of data will take our compliance team a significant amount of time, especially since we are currently restructuring the department following a recent personnel departure." Sensing the chief operating officer losing his grip on the narrative, Talia Voss immediately stepped in. This was her domain. She specialized in character assassination, and she aggressively deployed the only weapon she brought to the table. "To add context to Mr. Mercer's point," Talia stated smoothly, folding her hands tightly on the table, "the personnel departure he mentioned was Brinley Diaz. She was our senior compliance analyst, and unfortunately, she was the root cause of the current administrative delay. Miss Diaz was a deeply disgruntled, difficult employee who fiercely resisted our efforts to modernize the company culture. We were forced to terminate her employment late last week due to severe documented violations of our operational protocols, specifically gross time theft. She was fundamentally untrustworthy. Frankly, we suspect she may have intentionally sabotaged her own credential handover on her way out the door. It was a classic, brutal corporate maneuver. Blame the absent, low-level worker. Paint the whistleblower as a bitter, vindictive failure. Under normal circumstances, against a junior auditor or a local state inspector, it might have actually worked. But Maren Holt was not a local inspector. Holt reached into her battered canvas bag. She did not pull out a complicated financial ledger or a dense legal statute. She pulled out a single, standard sheet of printer paper. She slid it across the long expanse of the polished mahogany table until it came to a dead stop directly in front of Talia Voss. It was a flawless, full-color printed copy of the exact email Talia had sent to the entire company and the external partners on Thursday evening. My official badge photograph stared up at the ceiling, right above the bold red text declaring me a terminated time thief over a 2-minute infraction. "I am very familiar with your assessment of Miss Diaz," Holt said softly, though her voice carried perfectly across the dead silent room. "My office was inadvertently copied on this exact broadcast. I read it on Thursday night." Talia swallowed hard, the color rapidly draining from her face. Grant Mercer stared at the paper as if it were a live explosive device. Holt leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. "So, Miss Voss, I have a very simple, operational question for you. You just stated on the record that Brinley Diaz was a fundamentally untrustworthy, disgruntled employee who committed severe misconduct. You broadcasted to the entire state that she was a thief. You terminated her access to this building. Holt paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out for 3 agonizing seconds. If she was so incredibly dangerous and untrustworthy, Holt continued, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper, then why did this executive team use her exact digital identity to certify a federal request for tens of millions of dollars of taxpayer grant money 30 hours after you threw her out onto the street? The boardroom fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. There was no corporate jargon left to deploy. There was no public relations spin that could possibly explain away the massive, glaring contradictions sitting in the middle of the table. If they admitted they used my name because I was actually the only competent analyst they had, they confessed to federal forgery and perjury. If they claimed a computer did it automatically, they confessed to a total catastrophic failure of their own internal compliance controls, which would instantly strip them of their federal clearance anyway. They were trapped in a cage entirely of their own making, and any word they spoke would only tighten the bars. They could not answer the question without instantly incriminating themselves, so they said absolutely nothing. Grant Mercer stared blankly at the far wall. Talia Voss looked down at her hands, completely stripped of her usual arrogant authority. The first visit from the federal government did not end with loud shouting. It did not end with dramatic arrests or people being dragged out in handcuffs. It ended with the terrifying, cold machinery of federal oversight methodically locking the doors from the outside. Maren Holt stood up and smoothed the front of her gray blazer. Her silent partner finally spoke, reading from his legal pad with the emotionless cadence of an executioner. Effective immediately, Crownspire Mobility Group is under a mandatory comprehensive data preservation order, the agent recited. You are hereby ordered to enact a total freeze on all internal and external data repositories. You will surrender all physical and digital access logs. You will surrender all file metadata from the executive suite covering the last 90 days. You will surrender all internal human resources policy records and communication archives. And you will immediately surrender all vendor ownership disclosures, specifically those related to your disadvantaged business enterprise partners. Holt picked up her canvas bag. She looked at Grant Mercer one last time. We will return tomorrow morning with our technical retrieval team. Do not touch a single server. They walked out of the boardroom, leaving the executives sitting in the ruins of their own arrogance. The trap had not just closed. The walls were now rapidly crushing inward. The call came at exactly 8 o'clock on Wednesday evening. The caller identification displayed a restricted number I did not immediately recognize, but the breathless, hurried voice on the other end was entirely unmistakable. It was Amelia Hart. Amelia was a young, blisteringly smart associate attorney buried deep within the Crownspire Mobility Group legal department. Unlike the senior partners who spent their lucrative days shielding the executive suite from consequence, Amelia actually read the complex compliance statutes. She had always treated me with a quiet, professional respect that was exceedingly rare in the toxic environment of that building. I am calling from an encrypted app on my personal phone while sitting in a grocery store parking lot 3 towns over, Amelia said, her voice tight with residual adrenaline and a distinct undertone of fear. I cannot stay on the line long because they are auditing the internal communication logs right now, but you need to know what is actually happening inside the building. The ground is completely falling out from under them. I leaned against my kitchen counter, gripping the cold metal of the phone tightly. They brought in the federal technical retrieval team this morning. I assume the data preservation process did not go well for Grant Mercer. It was a complete and utter bloodbath, Amelia replied, her words rushing out in a furious whisper. The executives thought they had quarantined the damage. They truly believed the federal auditors were only looking at the rejected signature hash from your compromised credential on Friday night. They were completely wrong. Do you remember the system maintenance window on Thursday afternoon? The one that caused Nolan to let your team leave the office early? I closed my eyes, picturing the exact moment in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office. Yes. I was drafting a highly sensitive review memo right before the servers went offline. I never finished it. You never finished it. And you never hit the send button, Amelia said. But the overarching enterprise software has an automated disaster recovery protocol built into the mainframe. It takes ghost snapshots of all active, unsaved drafts every 15 minutes to prevent data loss. When the federal investigators demanded the unredacted metadata yesterday, they did not just pull the active files, they pulled the entire recovery cache. They found your unfinished memo. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. That specific memo was my master list of suspicions. It was the exact, highly detailed document that outlined every single mismatched vendor invoice, every questionable routing number, and every altered payroll ledger I had flagged over the past 3 months. The scope of the audit has completely expanded, Amelia continued, her breathing heavy. Your memo gave them the exact map they needed to bypass the standard review process and go straight for the jugular. They subpoenaed the banking records for Pine Trace Community Partners this afternoon. It is exactly what you suspected. Brinley, Pine Trace has absolutely 0 full-time staff members. They have no field personnel. They have no operational footprint whatsoever. CrownSpire has been funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars to a ghost entity just to artificially inflate our disadvantaged business enterprise participation percentages. They needed to keep those specific vendor metrics perfectly high to maintain their elite federal contract evaluation scores. The sheer scale of the deception began to solidify in my mind. It was not just a lazy administrative oversight, it was a meticulously constructed financial illusion designed to drain public infrastructure funds directly into private pockets, entirely subsidized by the American taxpayer. But that is not even the worst part, Amelia said, taking a sharp, shaky breath. The investigators cross-referenced your memo notes with the physical site payrolls for the massive electrical teams working on the Interstate Highway Expansion project. They found a catastrophic discrepancy in the prevailing wage classifications. I knew exactly what she was about to say. In federal contracting, every single laborer must be paid a strict, legally mandated hourly rate based on their specific skill level and job duties. A master electrician costs significantly more than a first-year apprentice. They were intentionally downcoding the laborers, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Exactly, Amelia confirmed, the disgust evident in her tone. CrownSpire was officially billing the federal government for top-tier master electricians, claiming the maximum allowable reimbursement rate from the taxpayer grant. But on the internal payroll ledgers, they deliberately classified dozens of those exact same workers as entry-level apprentices or general laborers. The company paid the workers the absolute lowest possible legal wage and quietly pocketed the massive difference in the reimbursement checks. It is wage compliance fraud on an industrial scale. The pieces of the massive puzzle slammed together with a deafening, terrifying finality. CrownSpire Mobility Group was running 2 separate fraud schemes at the same time. They were committing gross misrepresentation in their minority vendor reporting to secure the highly lucrative government contracts, and they were committing aggressive wage theft against their own laborers to illegally maximize the profit margins on the back end. Grant is completely losing his mind up on the executive floor, Amelia whispered. He is trying to figure out a way to pin the wage discrepancies on the independent site foreman, but your recovered memo specifically noted that the executive suite was overriding the labor classification codes before the payroll was ever finalized. A cold, sharp memory pierced through my racing thoughts. It was a memory from exactly 3 weeks ago. I was sitting at my desk, staring at a glaring inconsistency in the electrical team payroll on my dual monitors. Grant Mercer had walked past my cubicle, stopped abruptly, and leaned closely over my shoulder. He had smelled like expensive cologne and stale coffee. I had pointed directly at the screen, showing him that the labor codes did not match the billing invoices. I remembered his exact words. He had smiled a tight, impatient smile and tapped his heavy gold ring against the wood of my desk. Listen to me very carefully, Brinley, Grant had said, his tone carrying a subtle, dangerous edge disguised as corporate urgency. "We have massive deadlines approaching for the new quarter. Do not make a big deal out of a few lines of labor code classifications. Just push the paperwork through the system and let the site managers handle the minor details." At the time, I had interpreted his command as the standard, arrogant impatience of a wealthy corporate executive who prioritized speed and quarterly bonuses over regulatory accuracy. I thought he was just being incredibly sloppy. Now, standing in the quiet isolation of my apartment, the true, horrifying meaning of his words echoed with sinister clarity. It was not a plea for efficiency. It was a direct, calculated command from a superior to ignore an active crime scene. For the very first time since that freezing Thursday evening, the absolute, undeniable truth of my termination washed over me in a wave of freezing clarity. I finally understood the terrifying reality of my situation. My sudden dismissal had absolutely nothing to do with Talia Voss and her rigid, power-hungry obsession with enforcing draconian human resources policies. It had absolutely nothing to do with me leaving the office a pitiful 120 seconds before the clock officially struck 5 in the afternoon. The 2-minute discrepancy was nothing but a convenient, easily weaponized excuse fabricated out of thin air. Grant Mercer knew I was looking way too closely at the labor codes. He knew I was questioning the Pine Trace invoices. He knew the massive quarterly federal draw was scheduled for Monday morning, and he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was the final authorized certifier who would inevitably demand concrete answers before legally signing my name to those wildly fraudulent documents. They did not fire me to make a terrifying example out of me for the rest of the staff. They fired me because they desperately needed me to disappear before the weekend arrived. They needed an empty compliance chair so they could blindly forge my signature and push the multi-million-dollar lie through the federal gateway before the quarterly audit cycle closed. The public humiliation, the brutal company-wide email, the immediate physical lockout from the building, it was all a desperate, highly calculated corporate assassination designed exclusively to clear the path for the largest financial theft in the history of the company. "Amelia," I said, my voice completely steady, hardened into steel by the sheer weight of the revelation. "They are going to try to burn the rest of the evidence tonight. They have to destroy the physical files before the investigators return." "They cannot do a single thing," Amelia replied, a hint of dark, vengeful satisfaction finally creeping into her voice. The investigators fully anticipated that panic response. The federal technical team completely severed CrownSpire from its own primary servers at noon today. The entire company network is currently running on a localized, read-only mirror. Nobody in the executive suite can delete a single comma or alter a single spreadsheet. The real, unadulterated data is already locked inside a highly secure government vault in Washington. The ground beneath CrownSpire Mobility Group had not just shifted. It had completely collapsed into a sinkhole of their own making. The silent, mechanical trap I had unknowingly left behind had not merely caught a forged digital signature. It had violently ripped the entire polished facade off a corporate empire, exposing the rotting criminal core underneath for the whole world to see. "Keep your head down, Amelia," I warned her, genuinely concerned for her safety in that volatile building. "Do not let anyone know you spoke to me. Delete this call log immediately." "I will," she said softly. "Just watch the news tomorrow. Brinley, it is going to be a truly spectacular fire." She terminated the call. I slowly lowered the phone, staring out the window into the dark, sprawling city. The federal machine was running at full speed now, its gears grinding with unstoppable force, and it was preparing to completely devour every single person who had so arrogantly tried to use it as a weapon against me. The Columbus executive scene thrives almost entirely on malicious whispers and calculated leaks. By Thursday morning, those whispers had materialized into highly damaging digital print. I was sitting at my kitchen island, nursing a cup of black tea, when an anonymous source forwarded me a direct link to the Ohio Infrastructure Chronicle. It was a widely circulated, influential local business blog that every major contractor and state politician read religiously. The headline alone was designed to incite immediate industry outrage. The article described a massive, sudden federal investigative presence at a prominent, unnamed local mobility contractor. It noted that the federal inquiry was triggered by a catastrophic digital portal failure over the weekend. Then came the calculated poison. The author explicitly quoted an anonymous corporate insider who claimed that a disgruntled former compliance staffer, a woman who had recently been disciplined for severe attendance violations, had intentionally planted a logic bomb and sabotaged the enterprise software on her way out the door as an act of petty, vindictive revenge. The blog post was a masterpiece of corporate defamation. They were incredibly careful not to print my actual name or the exact name of the company to avoid an immediate libel lawsuit. They did not have to. Anyone holding a state grant contract or working within the regional compliance sector knew exactly who the unnamed senior analyst was. The executives were aggressively constructing a public narrative to frame me. They were trying to paint me as a malicious cyber vandal, desperately hoping to redirect the crushing federal heat away from their own systemic crimes and blame the entire system lockdown on my supposed temper tantrum. My cellular phone screen illuminated before I could even finish reading the final paragraph of the article. It was a direct, private message sent through a professional networking platform. The sender was Talia Voss. The sheer audacity of her message was genuinely breathtaking. She had abandoned her rigid, authoritative human resources persona and adopted the tone of a gracious diplomat offering a lifeline to a drowning woman. Brinley, I genuinely think it is in everyone's best interest if we sit down today and have a civilized conversation. Her message read, "Things have clearly escalated far beyond their original intended scope. The federal auditors are fundamentally misunderstanding the portal glitch. If you are willing to formally state on the record that the external system lock was merely a technical misunderstanding on your part, and that the database simply misinterpreted your erratic login habits, the company is fully prepared to graciously retract a significant portion of the internal allegations against you. We can rewrite your official departure as a mutual, amicable separation. Let us help each other move past this." It was a pathetic, transparent attempt at extortion wrapped in corporate civility. They wanted me to fall on my sword. They needed me to take full responsibility for the federal system lockdown, effectively admitting to an act of digital sabotage, in exchange for them graciously agreeing not to call me a time thief in public anymore. They believed I was weak enough to accept a slightly less humiliating lie just to make the nightmare stop. I did not dignify her message with a response. I did not type a single letter. I simply powered my phone down completely and placed it inside a drawer. I turned my attention to my dining table, which I had converted into a makeshift war room. I methodically began to compile my defense. I arranged my printed access logs, the saved email threads, and the internal memorandums into a strict chronological timeline. I was meticulously preparing for the absolute worst-case scenario, building an impenetrable fortress of raw data, knowing they would stop at nothing to bury me under their fabricated narrative. Then, the defensive shield I was building suddenly and violently transformed into an offensive weapon. I received a heavily encrypted file package sent to my secure private email address from a completely untraceable external routing server. I decrypted the payload and found a message from Sadie Cole, the quiet human resources intern. Sadie had not just saved the old attendance policies before the federal IT lockdown. She had actively, bravely documented Talia's crimes in real time during the peak of the corporate panic. The file contained a sequence of high-resolution screen captures showing the internal administrative dashboard of the human resources server. The images clearly displayed Talia Voss logged into the system, frantically drafting a brand-new corporate document explicitly titled Zero-Minute Tolerance Attendance Policy. The metadata embedded in Sadie's captures was the undeniable, earth-shattering smoking gun. Talia had created this draconian, zero-tolerance rule on Monday afternoon, a full 4 days after she had publicly fired me. Worse, the screenshots showed the exact moment Talia actively manipulated the internal system clock to backdate the document's official creation timestamp to the previous month. She was desperately trying to forge a retroactive corporate law to legally justify my termination. She needed to prove to the federal investigators that a strict, merciless attendance rule had existed all along, and that I had maliciously broken it. It was a blatant, undeniable act of documentary fraud, captured step by step by the very intern she had ordered to clean up her mess. Before I could even fully process the magnitude of Talia's forgery, another email dropped into my secure inbox. This one was from Nolan Price. The crushing weight of the federal subpoenas and the intense, suffocating internal interrogations by the legal team had finally shattered his cowardly facade. He sent a frantic, disjointed email, explicitly copying his own personal defense attorney on the chain. Brinley, I need to clear my conscience and set the record straight before I speak to the federal agents, Nolan wrote, his words practically vibrating with panic. I am officially documenting that on Thursday afternoon. I gave the entire compliance team direct, verbal authorization to leave the premises before the end of the shift. The parking structure was being locked down and barricaded by security for Grant Mercer's executive client mixer. I told you to leave early. You did not steal company time. You followed my explicit managerial instructions. The executives had spent an entire week trying to turn me into a rogue saboteur. They had tried to isolate me and crush me under the weight of their institutional power. Now their own people were eagerly handing me the knives. But the final, most beautiful piece of the puzzle arrived in the very last folder of Sadie's encrypted data dump. Before the Federal Technical Retrieval Team had seized control of the main servers, Sadie had quietly accessed the ground floor security desk logs. She had pulled the physical turnstile swipe records for the executive team on that exact same Thursday afternoon. I opened the spreadsheet and scrolled down to the executive suite exit records. My eyes scanned the timestamps, and a cold, bitter laugh caught in my throat. At exactly 4:47 in the afternoon, the heavy glass doors of the main lobby had opened. The security log showed consecutive verified badge swipes. Grant Mercer, Talia Voss, and 3 other senior vice presidents had swiped their badges and exited the building together. They had left the corporate headquarters a full 11 minutes before the official end of the operational workday. I stared at the numbers glowing on my monitor. The sheer, grotesque hypocrisy of it all was staggering. I had swiped out at 4:58. My tiny, insignificant fraction of time had been brutally weaponized against me. My 2 minutes had been publicly branded as gross misconduct and malicious time theft. I had been humiliated, stripped of my livelihood, and destroyed over 120 seconds. Yet, the exact same security system proudly recorded the executive leadership abandoning their posts a full 11 minutes early, walking out into the afternoon sun to drink expensive cocktails and eat catered food with their wealthy clients. In their twisted, toxic corporate hierarchy, my 2 minutes constituted a fireable felony, but their 11 minutes was simply classified as vital business hospitality. They had tried to paint me as a disgruntled saboteur to protect their crumbling empire. They thought they could bully me into silence with anonymous blog posts and fake olive branches. They did not realize they had just handed me the exact, undeniable proof required to burn their entire hypocritical kingdom straight to the ground. By Friday morning, exactly 1 week after my humiliating exit, the preliminary inquiry mutated into a full-scale, catastrophic federal siege. The Office of Transit, Grant Oversight, stopped asking polite questions and officially escalated the audit to Stage 4. The immediate consequence was purely financial, and it was devastatingly swift. Marin Holt issued a formal, binding directive that completely froze the upcoming quarterly capital drawdown. Tens of millions of dollars in anticipated federal reimbursements, the very lifeblood of the company, were instantly locked inside a highly secure government vault. But Holt did not stop there. She submitted a terrifying secondary notice declaring that her agency was opening a retroactive review to aggressively claw back all funds dispersed over the previous 3 fiscal quarters. Crown Spire Mobility Group was suddenly facing a liquidity death spiral. The board of directors, a collection of wealthy, insulated power brokers who usually golfed through corporate crises and ignored the daily operations, could no longer pretend this was just a localized human resources dispute. They had initially planned to sweep the entire ordeal quietly under an expensive rug, relying on Grant Mercer to handle the fallout. However, the arrogant, careless email Talia Voss had blasted out the previous week made that impossible. The state board member who had accidentally received my termination notice did not just delete it. He was a meticulous, old-fashioned man who despised corporate sloppiness, and he had immediately forwarded the bizarre, defamatory message directly to the state public ethics advisor, demanding a formal explanation as to why a major contractor was airing its dirty laundry on a government server. Amelia Hart called me from a chaotic, echoing stairwell inside the headquarters, the sound of frantic footsteps and slamming doors clearly audible in the background. "The board of directors is completely panicking," Amelia said, her voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper. "They just held an emergency session at 7 in the morning. They threw Grant out of the room. They no longer view your termination as a rogue human resources incident or a simple policy enforcement. They recognize it as an existential, radioactive threat to the entire corporate infrastructure. If the federal government revokes our standing because of this fraud exposure, every single public contract we hold across the state will be instantly voided. The company will cease to exist." The foundation of the building was not just cracking, it was violently splitting apart under the immense pressure. The Federal Technical Retrieval Team, armed with their absolute data preservation order, began excavating the digital graveyard of the executive suite. They focused their surgical attention on the exact time frame of Friday night, zeroing in on the hour the fraudulent federal submission was forced through the external gateway using my stolen digital identity. The Internal Information Technology Department buckled under the very first sign of federal pressure. An extremely nervous 25-year-old network administrator confessed to the federal agents that he had received a direct, panicked telephone order late Friday evening. He was instructed to permanently scrub the specific physical access logs and the network traffic history of a single, standalone laptop located deep inside the contracts department. That specific machine was the exact terminal where the forged compliance packet had originated. The executives actually believed deleting the local cache would sever the investigative trail. They fundamentally misunderstood how federal forensic software operated. The investigators simply bypassed the wiped hard drive and pulled the encrypted shadow backups directly from the master server farm. When they reconstructed the deleted data packets, they found a massive, undeniable digital footprint. The login credentials used to access that specific contract's laptop perfectly matched the biometric identifier of a tablet device Grant Mercer exclusively used during his late evening operational reviews. The revelation was the equivalent of throwing a lit match into a sealed room full of gasoline. The fragile, arrogant alliance within the executive suite instantly vaporized. The building descended into a vicious, cutthroat circular firing squad as every single department frantically tried to save itself by offering up the others to the federal agents. Talia Voss cornered the investigators in a glass hallway and loudly attempted to blame the entire forgery on a rogue information technology staffer, claiming they had bypassed her authority and acted independently. The head of information technology immediately retaliated by marching straight into the boardroom and presenting a printed email showing he was just following vague legal advice regarding data retention. The general counsel vehemently denied offering any such advice, turning pale, and pointed a trembling finger directly at the contracts division, stating they were the only ones desperate enough to push the unverified draw through the portal to secure their quarterly bonuses. They were a pack of starving wolves, and they were finally turning their teeth on each other to survive. While the corporate executives tore themselves apart in the penthouse suite, the real, tangible consequences of their greed began to surface on the ground level. The news of the federal audit concerning the labor codes had leaked to the massive public work sites. Dozens of heavy machinery operators, master electricians, and concrete pourers finally realized why their paychecks had felt so light over the past year. Union representatives began swarming the corporate lobby, demanding immediate answers. Angry, exhausted laborers started volunteering devastating, first-hand testimonies to the federal agents. They provided photographs of their original, signed time cards, and showed the agents how their job classifications had been mysteriously downgraded from master tradesmen to entry-level apprentices after the paperwork was submitted to the headquarters. They confirmed they were doing highly skilled, dangerous work on the highways, while Crownspire secretly pocketed the premium federal wages meant to feed their families. The abstract, white-collar fraud had suddenly gained a very human, very angry face. The machine they had built to exploit the working class was now providing the exact testimony needed to destroy them. I sat alone in my quiet apartment, watching the news alerts flash across my computer screen one by one. A profound, surreal shift had occurred in the balance of power. Just 7 days ago, I was the ultimate corporate pariah. I was the disgraced time thief, the woman whose face had been plastered across the industry as a brutal warning to anyone who dared to step out of line. The entire company had looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust as I carried my cardboard box out the door. Now, I was the absolute center of gravity. I was the sole keeper of the original, uncorrupted compliance records. I was the person who possessed the unedited vendor communications, the unaltered payroll screenshots, and the hidden human resources policies that proved their malicious intent. Every single desperate executive, terrified board member, and federal investigator suddenly realized that my testimony was the only thing that could either completely destroy them or selectively save them from a federal indictment. My phone began to ring endlessly, lighting up with the names of powerful people who had entirely ignored my existence for 8 long years. I did not answer a single call. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back in my chair, and simply let the ruthless, mechanical trap they had built continue to eat them alive. A thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment via a private corporate courier early Saturday morning. The return address did not belong to the internal legal department I was used to dealing with. It belonged to a massive, incredibly expensive corporate defense firm based in Chicago. The board of directors had officially panicked and bypassed their own compromised in-house counsel. Inside the envelope was a dense, highly aggressive settlement agreement. They were no longer trying to intimidate me with anonymous blog posts or vague threats. They were trying to buy me. The contract offered me 6 months of my full senior analyst salary, paid out in a single, untraceable lump sum. They offered to completely expunge the catastrophic termination notice from my permanent employment record. They even included a pre-written, agonizingly neutral letter of recommendation signed by the chief executive officer himself. In exchange for this sudden generosity, the demands were absolute. I had to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that would legally gag me for the rest of my natural life. More importantly, I was required to provide a sworn written statement to the federal investigators officially declaring that the forged signature on the federal portal was nothing more than a simple operational confusion. They wanted me to tell the government that I had accidentally left my terminal logged in, and the system had simply malfunctioned. I read the final page of the contract. They promised to distribute a brief internal retraction notice to the staff, but the legal language explicitly stated that Crownspire Mobility Group admitted absolutely zero fault. There would be no admission of retaliation. There would be no admission of wage theft or vendor fraud. I sat at my kitchen table, feeling the heavy, expensive paper between my fingers. The sheer arrogance of the offer was breathtaking. They honestly believed that every human being had a price tag. They thought I would eagerly snatch the money and run away, terrified by the sheer scale of the machine I had accidentally broken. I recognized the offer for exactly what it was. They did not want justice. They did not want to fix the rotting core of their corporate empire. They simply wanted to purchase the silence of the one person in the entire state who was no longer afraid of them. I took a black pen, drew a single, thick line through the signature block, and handed the unsigned contract back to the waiting courier without saying a single word. By Monday afternoon, the battlefield shifted from the digital servers into the physical world. Marin Holt had officially subpoenaed the entire board of directors, forcing a dozen wealthy insulated power brokers to fly into Columbus for an emergency closed-door hearing. Because I was the central witness to the inciting incident, Holt required me to be physically present. I sat quietly in the back corner of the grand executive boardroom, flanked by two silent federal agents, watching the corporate hierarchy violently consume itself. Talia Voss sat near the center of the massive mahogany table. The untouchable, terrifying human resources director I knew just a week ago had completely vanished. Her posture was rigid with sheer panic. When the furious board chairman demanded to know why she had recklessly broadcasted a highly defamatory termination notice to external state officials, Talia immediately resorted to the only survival tactic she knew. She attempted to sacrifice the weakest person in the room. She pointed a trembling but manicured finger directly at Sadie Cole, the young intern who had been dragged into the hearing to take notes. The external broadcast was a complete administrative error executed by a junior subordinate, Talia stated, her voice tight and defensive. I explicitly requested a standard internal disciplinary memo. The intern completely overstepped her authority. She went rogue, maliciously attaching the security badge photograph and blasting the message to the external project mailing lists without any executive oversight or final approval from my desk. Sadie was sitting 2 chairs away from her boss. The young woman was trembling so violently that her hands physically rattled against the polished wood of the table, but she did not break. She did not lower her eyes. Sadie reached into her cheap canvas tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of printed papers. It was the encrypted cloud backup she had bravely secured before the federal servers were seized. Sadie slid a vividly clear, high-resolution screenshot of their direct messaging history straight across the long table toward the chairman. I did not act alone, and I did not go rogue, Sadie said, her voice shaking but carrying a fierce, undeniable core of steel. You reviewed the final draft at exactly 4 p.m. on Friday. You approved the distribution list. The image projected onto the boardroom monitors proved everything. It showed that Talia had not only read every single word of the draft, but she had personally typed the aggressive subject line. The final message from Talia, glowing in bright blue text for the entire board of directors to see, read, "Make sure they remember," before Talia could even attempt to fabricate a defense against her own written words. Amelia Hart stepped forward from the shadows of the legal team. Amelia placed a single, bound forensic report directly in front of the board chairman. It was the detailed metadata analysis of the strict zero-tolerance attendance policy that Talia had proudly submitted to the board as her official legal justification for my sudden firing. Amelia spoke with a calm, lethal precision that cut through the stifling air of the room. The policy document you are currently holding, Mr. Chairman, is a complete fabrication, Amelia declared. The digital footprint extracted by the Federal Retrieval Team proves conclusively that this specific attendance rule did not exist when Miss Diaz swiped her badge on Thursday. It was artificially generated, deliberately backdated, and saved to the Human Resources server exactly 10 hours after she was escorted out of the building. Ms. Voss forged a retroactive corporate law to justify a retaliatory termination. Maren Holt stood up from her chair in the back of the room. The atmosphere in the boardroom instantly dropped to absolute freezing. Based on the physical evidence presented in this room, Holt announced, her voice echoing with the full, crushing weight of the federal government, my office is immediately expanding the scope of this investigation. We are no longer simply looking at a misallocated labor grant or a forged digital signature. We are officially pursuing criminal charges for obstruction of justice and retaliatory documentation tampering against the Human Resources Department. Talia Voss buried her face in her hands. A low, pathetic sob escaped her throat. Her carefully constructed corporate persona had finally collapsed, but the true tension, the explosive core of the hearing, had not yet been detonated. Holt turned her cold, unwavering gaze away from the ruined Human Resources Director and locked eyes directly with Grant Mercer. The Chief Operating Officer had been sitting in complete, calculated silence, desperately hoping the furious board would be entirely satisfied with Talia's dramatic destruction. Holt walked to the center of the room and dropped a thin manila folder onto the polished wood. It contained the corporate ownership registry and the tax filings for Pine Trace Community Partners, the phantom minority vendor they had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars into over the past year. Holt did not raise her voice. She did not yell. She simply looked at the board chairman and issued a single, devastating request. "Mr. Chairman," Holt said smoothly, "I require you to immediately pull Mr. Mercer's mandatory annual conflict of interest disclosure forms from his executive personnel file. We need to review them on the record." The room fell into a suffocating, terrifying quiet. The blood rapidly drained from Grant Mercer's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in an expensive tailored suit. He knew exactly what the federal agents had discovered in the shadow servers. The investigators were officially demanding to cross-reference the registered owner of the fake community outreach program with the legally binding documents Grant had personally signed under penalty of perjury. His entire defense strategy, his polished aura of plausible deniability, began to violently fracture under the crushing weight of his own hidden signature. The federal noose was no longer just tightening around the Human Resources Department. It was dropping squarely over the neck of the executive suite. The silence in the boardroom was absolute and suffocating. Maren Holt did not yell, and she did not pace around the room. She simply stood at the head of the polished mahogany table and began laying out the case against them, piece by piece, using their own internal data. She laid out the complete, unbroken chain of evidence for the terrified board of directors to see. She started with the exact digital timestamp of my termination, proving definitively that I was officially fired and escorted off the premises at roughly 5 o'clock on Thursday evening. She followed it immediately with a printed copy of the defamatory email blasted to the external partners just hours later. Then, she placed the forensic metadata analysis, proving Talia Voss had forged the corporate attendance policy 10 hours after the fact. Next came the digital server logs, showing my stolen identity being used at 11:45 on Friday night to submit the quarterly compliance packet. Finally, she dropped the ownership records for Pine Trace Community Partners right next to the physically altered electrical payroll ledgers. Grant Mercer stared at the federal investigator, his polished executive facade melting into pure, unadulterated desperation. When Holt explicitly asked him to explain his family connection to the ghost vendor, Grant attempted to lie directly to the faces of the board members. He puffed out his chest and claimed Pine Trace was a legitimate third-party entity, insisting that any familial relation was a distant, irrelevant coincidence that had absolutely no bearing on the distribution of federal grant money. Holt did not argue with him. She simply opened her heavy canvas tote bag and produced a certified copy of the State Limited Liability Company registration, alongside a matching set of federal tax returns. The documents clearly showed that hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled directly from the CrownSpire operational budget into a suburban insurance agency owned by Grant's brother-in-law, before being swiftly transferred into a private family trust. The lie collapsed instantly, crushed under the weight of undeniable paper evidence. Talia Voss, watching her powerful corporate protector fall apart, desperately clung to her original, fabricated narrative. She wiped her eyes, her hands shaking violently, and pointed her finger at the empty chair where I used to sit. "Brinley Diaz violated the core principles of this company," Talia cried out, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "She left the building early. She deliberately stole company time. We had a strict zero-tolerance policy, and we had every legal right to terminate her employment." Maren Holt did not even look at the Human Resources Director. She kept her eyes locked on the board chairman and cut Talia off with a voice as cold and hard as winter concrete. 2 minutes did not cause a federal audit, Ms. Voss," Holt said smoothly. "Systemic, multi-million-dollar fraud caused a federal audit." That single sentence was the final nail in the coffin. The board of directors realized they were standing on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship, and they immediately began throwing the heavy cargo overboard to save themselves. The chairman bypassed all standard corporate protocols and called for an emergency, immediate vote. Grant Mercer and Talia Voss were terminated on the spot. They were stripped of their lucrative severance packages, denied their stock options, and escorted out of the building by the very same security guards they had used to publicly humiliate me just days prior. Furthermore, 3 other senior vice presidents were immediately suspended without pay and barred from the premises for their active roles in attempting to destroy the server logs and reconstruct the forged files. But firing the corrupt executives was not nearly enough to stop the federal machine. Holt formally announced the immediate government sanctions. The entire quarterly capital drawdown, worth tens of millions of dollars, was permanently frozen. Furthermore, CrownSpire Mobility Group was officially suspended from the state and federal public bidding registry. They could no longer touch a single taxpayer dollar. Holt concluded the meeting by informing the Pale Sa silent board members that the entire evidentiary file was being transferred directly to the Department of Justice Contract Fraud Division for criminal prosecution. Before the week was over, the company was legally compelled by the Federal Oversight Office to issue a formal, heavily monitored retraction. A new email was dispatched to the exact same massive distribution list, reaching every single internal employee and external partner. The subject line was clear and unavoidable. The message officially confirmed that Brinley Diaz had never committed time theft, that my termination was entirely baseless, and that my professional identity had been illegally hijacked by the executive team after my departure to facilitate a fraudulent federal submission. The fallout rippled far beyond the polished glass walls of the corporate headquarters. Armed with the unedited labor codes that the federal agents had recovered from my unfinished draft, the union representatives launched a massive, coordinated legal strike against the company. The heavy machinery operators, the master electricians, and the concrete workers who had been intentionally downgraded were cleared to receive massive amounts of retroactive back pay. The isolated payroll anomaly transformed into a sweeping statewide investigation that touched dozens of other active construction sites, forcing CrownSpire to open their deepest financial vaults to compensate the laborers they had so arrogantly exploited for years. I never asked for my job back. When the desperate board of directors eventually reached out, offering me a senior executive title and a massive salary increase to return and rebuild their shattered compliance department, I simply declined the call. I had no desire to stand in the middle of a ruined office and gloat over the ashes of their careers. True victory does not require a loud, theatrical display of dominance. Instead, I took the deep knowledge I had gained and built something entirely my own. I opened an independent consulting firm, Diaz Integrity Advisory, specializing in strict, uncompromising federal compliance oversight for massive public infrastructure projects. I rented a small, quiet office with a beautiful view of the city skyline. On the wall directly behind my desk, I hung 2 pieces of paper inside a simple black frame. One was the original, humiliating email branding me a corporate thief over 120 seconds. The other was the official federal retraction letter clearing my name completely. They sit side by side as 2 essential pieces of the exact same truth. They fired me for leaving 2 minutes early, but they were the ones who ran too far from the truth, and this time, the federal clock was the thing that caught up to them. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment and let me know where you are watching from. And if you want to support the channel, please like the video and subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories.